In this video, we'll continue our mesh baking series by exploring how to avoid common baking issues by using name-based mesh matching in InstaMAT Studio. By the way, if you've missed a video in our series, you can check out the links in the video description below. Now, without further ado, let's dive in. Now, before we jump into InstaMat, I quickly wanted to take a detour into InstaLOD just to take a look at the geometry and the meshes that we're going to be working with in this video. So as you can see here, I've got my target mesh, my low poly crate here, and I also have my source mesh. And this is using the baking workspace in InstaLOD. If you don't know, you can also do really great baking inside of InstaLOD as well. And so as you can see here, we've got a whole bunch of parts in our source mesh, like we've got these clasps and these different buttons and, the high poly version of these handles and things like that. And if we go into the target mesh, you can see it's much more simplified, right? We have simplistic handles. The body is much more generic. In fact, you can even see we don't have any of those little buttons or little rivets there on the low poly version of this crate because we're going to bake them on to this low poly version with UVs and such. Now, the way that we have this mesh organized is using a very typical high to low poly workflow where we add some suffixes to the names of our sub meshes in the scene. So you can see if my source mesh here, if I enable that, I can click on something like, this part here. You can see we have this buckle, right? So this is, the crate, metal buckle, and then we have underscore high. And then if I go to the target mesh, you can see that we have its counterpart, crate A, metal buckle, but this time the suffix is low. And between these low and high suffixes, this is how we're going to be able to distinguish between these groups of submeshes in our scene. In other words, we're only going to be baking the high version of this onto the low version here on our target mesh. In fact, you can also see if I click on these small little what do they call them? Bolts here. That we have the static mesh military crate A buckle high, and then we have something after this. So what this is going to do is it's going to bake these bolts onto the low poly buckle, which is a great way to be able to, bake additional parts onto this low poly mesh without having to have geometry for these bolts to bake onto. So now that you have a better understanding of how we have our geometry set up for this video, let's go ahead and jump on over to InstaMat. All right, so here we are in InstaMat, and I've gone ahead and brought in the target military crate here as my working mesh in this asset texturing project. You can see I've assigned that here. And I've also brought in the high poly, 1 million polygon crate into the package as well. So let's go ahead and start the baking process. And what I want to show you is I want to show you what happens when we use the default settings. In this case, I'm talking about the default targeting mode of all source meshes. So let's go ahead and bring in that source mesh. It's in the package, like I mentioned, and I'll go ahead and assign our 1 million polygon crate. Let's go ahead and use the GPU baker to have this baking process go a bit more swiftly. And so you can see here I have the targeting mode set to all source meshes, and we'll talk about the other one in a second here, but let's go ahead and press bake. So that's going to very quickly bake off all of our mesh maps here. We have the ambient occlusion, curvature, normal maps, all that kind of stuff, and we'll hit OK. So you can see here that the bake has done a pretty good job. If I go ahead and rotate the light here, you can see we've transferred a lot of those details pretty nicely. However, if we start to zoom in, you can see we have some issues here, mainly around, these pieces here, these complex pieces where we have parts that are pretty close to each other, like these handles on the front of the crate. Now, the reason why this happens is because the bakers are taking all of our source meshes into account when performing the bake. And it has to rely on the ray length to capture all of our source mesh details and transfer them properly onto our target mesh. Now, the problem with this is that not all of our parts of our mesh are related, and the baker doesn't always understand our intentions as artists when we create our high and low poly assets. And so this can result in unwanted details being projected onto unrelated areas on our target mesh, like you can see we have for our handle here. It didn't know that the handle was only supposed to bake onto itself and not onto the body of the crate as well. Now, one fix for issues like this is by going through a process of exploding the mesh. And this involves physically separating parts of the mesh by moving them into separate locations in 3D space so that the baker can more easily distinguish between different parts of the model. Now, while this can work, it's very time consuming to do this, especially for a large library of assets. And if it's a very complex asset, then even a singular asset can take a lot of time to be able to accomplish this exploding process. A more efficient solution is to use name-based baking, which allows you to match specific parts of your source mesh to corresponding parts of your target mesh by giving them matching submesh names like we saw earlier in InstaMAT. This tells the baker exactly which high poly parts should bake onto the correct low poly surfaces without having to move your geometry around in the scene or create additional versions of every asset. So let's now take a look at how this works in InstaMAT Studio. So we're back here in my project, and I'm just going to go ahead and reopen the baking panel here. We can load the original baking settings. That's just going to restore, using the GPU in this case. And instead of using the targeting mode of all source meshes, we're going to use by mesh name. And so because we're now using by mesh name, you can see we now have a target mesh suffix and a source mesh suffix. And so the target mesh is going to have all of those parts that we saw in InstaMAT that have the underscore low suffix. That's what we're going to be baking onto. And then the source mesh suffix is what is the object or the submesh that we're going to bake from? What's the high poly information? So we're going to bake all the parts in the source mesh that have the corresponding underscore high name, and we're going to bake them onto the target mesh that has the underscore low name. And so that's all we need to do in this case because we have our mesh set up correctly. So I'll go ahead and hit bake again. We're going to go ahead and rebake that. And I'm just going to go ahead and replace all of the original maps that we had here in our project. And so now that that's done, we can go ahead and take a look at our results. And there you go. We can see that we have a really nice bake here, but we don't have any of that information being projected onto other surfaces, other unwanted parts of the model. So the handle baked with the handle, the body baked the curvature and the nice forms onto the body. And you can even see here that we have those rivets on the surface of this singular clasp that we have here as well, baked onto there as well with no issues. So as you can see, it's very easy to set up low to high poly baking and using baking by mesh name by using this targeting mode here. So you can set up all your models with low poly and high poly appropriate suffixes, then use bake by mesh name with the mesh baking panel in InstaMAT Studio to prevent unwanted projections and baking artifacts. All right, so that's it for this video for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. If you enjoyed this video, drop us a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe. For the latest news about InstaMAT, please visit our website, follow us on X, join us on Discord, or sign up for the Abstract community. You can find all the links in the video description below. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next one.